Hello, welcome back. My name is Adam. This is part of my continuing course of understanding this book, Modern Poker Theory, building an unbeatable strategy based on GTO principles. We're going to talk about what a lot of those words in the subheader mean today, what it means to build a unbeatable strategy, and what GTO principles are. So we're going to go into and do some definitions here. I think a lot of people in the poker community have some pretty weak understandings of what game theory is, and I'm hoping to resolve some of these misconceptions today. So let's go ahead and do some definitions. So we're talking about game theory, and when I'm talking about game theory, in this case, I'm talking about John Nash, John Newman, game theory, well outside of poker specifically. So, game theory is the study of mathematical models of strategic interactions among rational agents. These agents are assumed to always try to take the most optimal action based on given premises and information. It has applications across many fields of studies, including economics, psychology, biology, politics, and many other things, including actual games such as poker. Okay? So that's we'll get into a little bit more what that means on the next slide. Let's do a few more definitions. A game is any interaction between multiple people called players in which each player's payoff is affected by the decisions made by others. So a game in game theory does not have to be an actual game, though it can be, as we allude here. It can be it's any interaction between multiple people, and how it's sussed out. Okay, utility is the overall measure of happiness players get from specific outcomes. Higher utility numbers imply that the outcome is preferred. Okay. In the poker world, this is normally shown as EV, or expected value, although that is not the only utility one gets from game theory or from the game of poker. Strategy. Strategy is a full specification of a player's behavior, describing each action a player would take at every possible decision point throughout the game. So, this is actually very important to understand. This is why this is so complex. This is why making this course has turned out to be so much more difficult than I initially imagined, but it actually makes sense. So when we're talking about strategies, we are building an unbeatable strategy based on GTO principles. It needs to be understood as a full specification of every action that you would take, flop, turn, river. I mean, honestly, things like game selection and just like what stakes you're playing, bankroll measurement, those are all part of a strategy to approaching the game and every action you make in the game. This is as opposed to things like tactics. This is a word that's being used lately that I've been hearing. A tactic is how do you what hand should you check raise on the river or whatever, like any specific decision point. Oh, how do we approach this exact spot? A strategy is all encompassing. It's every part of the game. A few more specific words that you've probably heard more. Pure strategy, so where you take the same action is always taken because it's always the best action. A mixed strategy is one where you are taking different actions at the same point. And a dominant strategy is one strategy yields a higher payoff regardless of which strategy the other player chooses. This is also related to a dominated strategy, which we'll get into later when we get into our example. But you never want to do a dominated strategy. You always want to do a dominating strategy. A common example. All right, we're going to borrow, these are just some charts from pokercoaching.com. You can find raise first in or pre-flop charts at a lot of sites. I'm just using this one chart as an example today, just to show, everything up here, these are pure strategies. You would always want to raise king in the cutoff at 40 big blinds. This is an example of a mixed strategy. The king 8-0 here, you would, if you're trying to follow this chart precisely, which you should not. We'll get into how to build a whole strategy. I mean, as we go, that's what the entire course is about. But this is a tool. These preflop charts are tools. Your solvers are tools. Your Nash equilibrium equations are tools. We're trying to learn how to use our tools. And as we'll talk about in a minute, we don't want to blindly follow any of our tools. But anyway, just as an example of a mixed strategy is that if you're following this strategy, they're mixing the king 8 offsuit here, and they're mixing like the 9-6 suited. They're super mixing. Are you finding that? 5% of the time you're opening the 5-7 suited, and 95% of the time you're folding. Better find that exactly. We'll get into that later. I don't want to sound like I'm denigrating. Again, raise first in charts are very useful tools, but they need to be used properly. Anyway, so those are just examples of pure strategy and mixed strategy. We'll do some more examples where you see dominated and dominating strategies later, but those are fairly easy to see. Folding aces pre-flop in a cash game is a dominated strategy. It is never good to just fold ace pre-flop in a cash game. You could come up with a scenario like, oh, you're on the bubble of a satellite or whatever. Like there's possibly times you could fold it, but certainly in a cash game, you don't fold your aces pre-flop. That is a dominated strategy. All right, we're just going to keep going. All right, game theory, a deeper look. All right, so what is game theory? Like, what is all that gobbledygook that I just said? What does that actually mean? That is a very good question, and that is actually what we're trying to learn today and throughout this course. Here are some good questions that I have posed. Things like, what does that actually mean? How do we apply this game theory to our understanding of the game or to the development of a strategy? And what can we reasonably expect to learn from studying it? And what can it not tell us? That's also. In my experience in poker study, so a little background on me, anyone who's just joining for the first time or just hasn't seen it, I've been playing for a little over 20 years. When I first started playing, strategy was read Super System. That was it. Like, and for one thing, I mean, which is actually probably fine. Like, especially back then, Super System was a relevant book for decades, and up until when I started in the early 2000s, it was still a very relevant book. I haven't looked at it lately. I'm sure some of the strategies it says are probably questionable these days, and I'm sure some of them are probably still pretty reasonable. But as we have moved from that into this new world of GTO, these kinds of questions are often glossed over. People, in fact, I remember I was first introduced to the concept of Nash equilibrium. It was in regards to poker. It was around 2005, 2006, and the bit I was reading about it specifically mentioned how game theory has this complex thing, and it has all these things, but we didn't need to know all that. We don't need to worry about any of that. Nash equilibrium is all we need to know and understand. All that other stuff is just gobbledygook, and we don't need to know. And again, similar to how Super System was fine for decades, maybe that advice from 2006 was fine for a decade. Maybe there was a time that just understanding Nash equilibrium was sufficient. But as the whole of the poker community has grown and expanded, I do not believe it is I don't believe it is. It is no longer sufficient to simply say that it doesn't matter and we don't need to delve into it. We do need to delve into it, and I strongly believe that the next generation of poker superstars are going to be people who actually look at this theory and think about that and apply that. And I'm not saying don't do solver work, but I'm saying apply this to solver work and know what it means. Understand what your solver is actually doing. And that is what we're trying to do. This entire point of me making this whole course and all that is an attempt to answer these questions and to delve into this subject. So let's keep moving. let's do that. It is important to understand the game theory is an attempt by humans. Game theory is a man-made system, and humans are fallible. Okay, it is an attempt by humans to understand the world in a rigorous mathematical way. It is fallible, And just because a strategy appears to be sound per the tenets of game theory does not necessarily mean it is definitively the best strategy. It is possible for the models to be wrong, just to straight up the Nash equilibrium stuff that we did, it was just incorrect. It didn't properly reflect the reality. It is also possible that the models are completely correct, but we are using it wrong, or we are putting in the wrong variables. More, talking about my background, I come from an engineering background, and one thing that is put strongly into our heads when you're in engineering school is it doesn't matter how correct if you use the complete correct equation, if you apply it to the wrong area, or especially if you make bad assumptions, if you put in bad inputs, your outputs are going to be bad. If you make bad assumptions and you put it in just whatever you think, and you're making incorrect variables or whatever, the answers you get are going to be wrong, and they may look right. And that's part of it's part of going to engineering school and whatnot, is learning how to figure out what things just aren't actually right, don't reflect the real world. And it's kind of what we're trying to do here today for the game of poker in the GTO sense. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. Let's go over some more terms. All right. So after saying all that, I'm going to say there's so much more to game theory than we're going to get into today, because there is a lot about game theory that does not apply to the game of poker. All of these terms here we're about to go over, these are in the game theory parlance. It's a good word for you. In game theory speak, poker would be a non-cooperative, symmetric, zero-sum, sequential, combinatorial game with imperfect information and metagame qualities. What does all that mean? Just quickly, so non-cooperatives means everyone's playing, we're not on teams, we're all individual. Symmetric, results only depend on the strategy used, not who you are. So that's difference versus, imagine just a sport or whatnot, where you have to be athletically fit or have to know certain specific things. I guess I can't use that as an example, because poker, there is definitely a learning curve in poker, but it would still count as symmetric, because anyone could learn to play poker. If you are willing to spend the time and study it, you can learn and you can compete with the best. That's the thing most people love about it. Zero sum, most people understand that. It's everything, for you to win, someone has to lose. Sequential, players act in a specific order. That's all that means. Doesn't really matter, but this is one of those things that we won't really talk about in the strategy, but it's so baked in that things like position, that's all this is saying. The fact that being on the button is better than being under the gun, well, it's because it's a sequential game. So it's worth at least throwing out there. Combinatorial, strategy is made more difficult through multiplicity of possible moves. That's another thing people, I think, are overlooking a little too much these days. If the proper way to play a hand varies based on your opponent's play, and if they're playing correctly or not, or playing per Nash equilibrium or not, you need to make adjustments to that. You have to know how to play, ace on this board versus this kind of player, but also ace on the same exact board against this kind of player, and also ace on this exact board against this kind of player, and also all your other hands you have to play and all that. So it's complicated. That's all it's saying. Imperfect information. This is one of the great things about poker and why it will not be solved for a very long time. The fact that there is information that one player knows that the other player doesn't know, and vice versa, just adds a complexity to the game that is really hard to overcome, especially with all the other things that make this a very complex game. And then the fact that it is a meta game. This is something most people are familiar with, at least intuitively. They may or may not have the exact verbiage, but it's the fact, everyone's doing all this studying. There's all these videos, being made. Everyone's talking strategy, and it changes the strategy over time. And you have to keep up with that. You have to, even if you don't necessarily believe your opponents are playing a correct strategy, you have to at least be vaguely aware of what strategy they're employing so that you can counteract it. All right, let us talk about the maximally exploitative strategy. Okay, a maximally exploitative strategy, why don't you get capitalized, Mr. S? Is the most profitable response to a opponent's fixed strategy. So, if you're programming, your opponent is a robot, you program them to do one thing exactly, you are figuring out the best way to, or best strategy to have against this fixed strategy. There is some strategy that is exactly the best strategy against that strategy. So you start doing that. But the, let's see, I'll make sure I'm not getting too ahead of myself. Before I go into that, yeah. So this is just, again, it's talking about mixed strategies having the same EV. I don't know why I put that on that line, but it is true. But, so you're going to play the hand in the perfect way to maximize EV against your opponent's fixed strategy. But the thing is you calculated against opponent's fixed strategy, but your opponent's strategy is not fixed. This is a meta game, remember? So your opponent is eventually going to figure out, well, you're doing this with this strategy, so they're going to stop doing one thing, they're going to start doing something else. So they will counter exploit it, especially if they are doing their own maximally exploitative strategy. So they're doing, you start off doing, this right here, they come in with this, so you got to do this, and it goes back and forth, and you keep maximally exploiting each other. In fact, that's what's similar to this next line. So it's an iterative process, right? So you're going back and forth. Well, eventually, you're going to reach Nash equilibrium. So go back to our foundation. This is John Nash, pure game theory stuff. John Nash. Nash equilibrium is a set of strategies where these assumptions are made. Players are clairvoyant. This does not mean, like in the game of poker, they still don't know your exact hand, but they do know your entire exact strategy. So this, think they know exactly what hand ranges you're playing, but also what you're doing with your hand ranges on every street, on every run out, regardless. Again, well, it also assumes that all players are maximally exploiting each other simultaneously, and that no player can unilaterally change their strategy to improve their own expectation. It's important to understand that these are the assumptions made in Nash equilibrium because these aren't actually real world assumptions. Like, these aren't actually true in the real game of poker. These are assumptions made in order to do Nash equilibrium strategies to do Nash equilibrium calculations to come up with a strategy. And again, Nash equilibrium is very important. I'm not trying to denigrate it. I'm trying to just show the limitations of it. An equilibrium strategy are maximally exploitative when played versus an unexploitable opponent. So that means that individual hands are always played in the most profitable way possible. Strictly dominated strategies are never used, and the only way a hand can be played more than one way is if they have equal EV. This is literally exactly what your solver is doing. When it comes up and you look under the hood and you see that it is doing, especially when you see it's mixing 3 different options, it's because it's calculated the EVs of all those options are the same. It's disregarding any strictly dominated strategies. And it's also very much assuming that your opponent is doing the same thing. Okay, so these are all baked in. It's important to understand that these are baked into the Nash equilibrium because one, we're trying to understand what Nash equilibrium actually is, but also to understand the limitations. One of the main reasons Nash equilibrium strategies are powerful is that they give you a guaranteed minimum EV. So if you are playing at a Nash equilibrium strategy, you will, and you are implementing that strategy absolutely correctly, you will have a certain minimum EV that if your opponent deviates their strategy away, you passively exploit them, which we'll get into some of that actually in a later video. But by them making mistakes from an equilibrium standpoint, you make money because that's in the game of poker. It's a zero sum game. You make money when your opponents make mistakes. If everyone is playing perfectly mistake free poker, the only person that makes money is the house or whatever, or just no one if there's no house. If we're doing a rake free environment, everyone just ultimately passes chips around. Okay, so if you're playing at equilibrium, though, your opponent makes a mistake, you do make money. However, uh, yeah, this is yeah. Anyway, I'm going off on a rant here. But what is important to understand here is that it is mathematically impossible for your opponent to gain an edge on you if you're playing at Nash equilibrium, which is why it's so popular. Makes sense. All right, and it is unexploitable. However, if you play equilibrium against an opponent who is not perfectly countering your strategy, uh, you will make EV. You will make more EV because they are not perfectly countering. However, the EV made will not be as high as a maximally exploitative strategy that is aiming at the specific mistakes your opponent is making. So it'll be like this is what you're expected. This is what you're expected to make. This is what you'd make because they're making mistakes. You make the little extra EV that they're giving you. But if you counter adjusted, specifically what they're doing, you're making this EV. Okay, that's all that's saying. All right, this is a very important area of contention that I want to try to be very specific on. This is kind of the inspiration for the whole video series here. Acevedo states in the book that in the poker world, GTO is often used as a synonym for Nash equilibrium, and he is correct that that is how the poker world often uses these words. However, it is a bad definition of the word GTO. GTO is better seen as a general theory. Game theory is this big, science that's bigger than the world of poker. It's its own thing happening over here. Then the optimal strategy to play poker based on game theory principles needs to consider this entire scientific field. And just to simply sum it up to the single term is wrong. So, the long and short of it is Nash equilibrium is GTO. Not all GTO is Nash equilibrium. It's not all of GTO. So for me personally, when you're watching any video of me or I'm talking about the game of poker, I will make a distinction between these two ideas. If I'm talking about equilibrium, I will call it Nash equilibrium strategies or just equilibrium or equilibrium strategies. GTO has a different definition, which we should go ahead and let's go ahead and make a better, more complete and correct definition of GTO, Game Theory Optimal. All right. Game Theory Optimal is an approach to thinking about the game of poker based on the scientific field known as game theory. And it is an attempt to play the game of poker optimally within the confines of the field of game theory. Okay? GTO is an attempt to quantify and study the game of poker based on specific mathematical models and the powerful computer programs that we can make using those models. GTO is not blindly following solver outputs or stubbornly trying to play as close to equilibrium in all circumstances. It is both impossible and unwise, at least from a financial standpoint, to try to play exactly like a solver. GTO is exploitative. Correctly deduced and executed exploitative play is GTO. These are one and the same. The debate of GTO versus exploitative is silly because when done correctly, they are one and the same. Remember, our definition of Nash equilibrium was based on our definition of maximally exploitative strategy. Maximally exploitative. It's the most exploitative you can be. GTO is the most exploitative you can be by definition. And these aren't even my definition. These are all from this book and also from we haven't gotten to Will Tipton's book, whatnot. These are definitions within the poker community, and yet they still like to conflate GTO and Nash equilibrium, which are not one and the same. And for some reason act as if that's where it comes from, because Nash equilibrium and exploitative play is not one and the same, but GTO is. Okay, so this is our better understanding of GTO. So moving forward, anytime you hear GTO or people talk about game theory optimal strategies of playing poker, you will think of this and not just whatever a solver puts out. All right, so I'm going to go over one more thing here. This is what I was talking about, Will Tipton and his thing. So, you don't know, expert heads up no limit hold'em, Volume 1, Optimal and Exploitative Strategies by Will Tipton. This is one of, if not the first, serious endeavor in a book to really delve into these principles and study. I think this book came out in like 2007, 8. I don't know. I could be wrong. I haven't looked that up lately, but I do know is certainly one of the earliest. So, equilibrium strategies are by definition maximally exploitative strategies. I mean, it says it right there. These are not my words. When facing an opponent who's playing his own. Now, then this is my own word. In the original quote, it says GTO right here, but he means GTO. He's saying GTO meaning equilibrium. So this is my own edit. So anyway, when facing an opponent who's playing his own equilibrium strategy, in this case, every hand is played as profitably as possible. So the only way a hand can be played in two different ways at the equilibrium is if both of these actions have exactly the same EV. This is known as the indifference principle. If a player plays a mixed strategy at equilibrium, then it must be that all actions he takes has a non-zero frequency, or all actions he takes with a non-zero frequency has the same EV. And this principle ultimately is connected with the idea of balance. You got to be balanced, right? Got to have a balanced strategy. Why? Well, because of the indifference principle. Why? Well, we'll get into that. I'm actually going to stop this video here. We're going to the next video is going to be a example, the toy game example. This will be one of the few I intend this to be one of the few full examples that I do for this course, because it is a huge pain in the neck, as you will see. But this concept of the indifference principle is demonstrated, and the power of the indifference principle is demonstrated very effectively through example. So that is what we will be doing on the next video. So thank you for sticking through to the end. Like I said, I'm Adam. Please leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are on some of the ideas presented here, and maybe start challenge yourself to think about this game in a little bit more complex, more robust way. And maybe you too can be the next poker superstar, or at least delve a little deeper into a complex but very interesting subject. Anyway, thank you, and I will see you on the next one.